Recording in progress.
Chair Ebnetter, we are ready to begin.
Thank you. Welcome to this special joint meeting of the Planning Commission and Sustainability and Infrastructure Commission this Tuesday evening, April 9th. I now call this meeting to order. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Could you please do the roll call, Ashley?
Yes. Chair Ebnetter of Planning Commission.
Present.
Vice Chair Patel of Planning Commission.
Present.
Commissioner Nugent of Planning Commission.
Present. Commissioner
Wiggins of Planning Commission.
Present.
And Commissioner Williams of Planning Commission.
Present.
Chair Berwinski of Sustainability and Infrastructure Commission.
Present.
Vice Chair Narita of Sustainability and Infrastructure Commission.
Here.
Commissioner Michael of Sustainability and Infrastructure Commission.
Here.
And Commissioner Riddlemeyer of Sustainability and Infrastructure Commission is absent. And then Commissioner Robbins of Sustainability and Infrastructure Commission.
Here.
Thank you. This is a special meeting. The conference ID is 843-4080-0756, and the passcode is 467675. Good evening and welcome. We are excited to be here in person with options for virtual participation. For those attending in person, complete a yellow request to speak slip and hand it to the clerk. If participating remotely, use the raise your hand feature in Zoom and you will be called on at the appropriate time. If calling in via phone, press star 9 to raise your hand, and when called upon, press star 6 to unmute your phone. These options for public comment will remain available until I close the public comment period for that specific item. And finally, we welcome speakers providing public comment, but please be advised this is a limited public forum. As such, speakers must stay on topic if speaking to a particular agenda item. If speakers fail to follow these rules, they will be warned, and if they continue to disregard the rules, their opportunity to speak will be ended. Next on the agenda is public comment period. Members of the public wishing to comment on any item not appearing on the agenda may address the Planning Commission and Sustainability and Infrastructure Commission at this time. State law prevents the Commission from taking action on any matter not on the agenda. Your comments may be referred to staff to follow up. Public comment is generally limited to a total of 15 minutes. However, that is subject to the Commission's discretion and to be extended if the Commission wishes to do so. So the public comment period is open now. Please bring slips to the clerk if you are in person here, or raise your hand on your Zoom or phone-in application.
Chair Ebnetter, we have no public commenters.
We'll close the public comment period. And Ashley, can you introduce study session number 1?
Yes. Item number 1, Citywide Transportation Demand Management Ordinance, Proposed Ordinance and Policy Manual.
Thank you. We will start with a staff presentation, clarifying questions from the commissions, and public comments. Members of the public are given 2 to 3 minutes to speak, depending on the number of speakers. Once the public comment period is closed, the Commission will deliberate and provide input and guidance to staff. This item is a study session only, so there will be no action taken on this item. So Ellen, can we please have the presentation?
Sure.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Chair Ebnetter, and all of our commissioners. We're really, really appreciative of you taking the time to come together tonight for this joint session. So again, I'm Sue Ellen Atkinson, Principal Transportation Planner with the Public Works Department, and I'm the project manager for the Citywide TDM Ordinance that we'll be discussing tonight. I have with me Matt Goyne, who is a principal with Fair and Peers, leading our consulting team. And Matt and I will both be presenting this evening. So first, just to orient you as we go through the presentation, we have 4 questions that we'd like to receive feedback on from all commissioners this evening, just so you can keep them in mind as we walk through the proposed TDM ordinance. So the first is if the thresholds and requirements for projects that are proposed to be subject to the citywide ordinance seem reasonable. The second are the required TDM measures for each project type appropriate? Third, is the penalty structure sufficient to induce compliance? And finally, is the supplemental policy manual clear regarding compliance with and implementation of the proposed policies? So tonight we'll be covering the project approach and current status. We'll go through feedback from our stakeholder groups and from both Planning and Sustainability and Infrastructure Commissions received in July, and then City Council feedback and direction received in November. Then we'll walk you through the proposed TDM program, which is comprised of the proposed ordinance and the policy manual, and then we'll walk through the remaining schedule and next steps. So first, project approach and status. So just to remind you the purpose of the citywide TDM ordinance, currently we have TDM requirements just in our rail corridor TOD area in San Mateo. So the purpose behind the citywide ordinance is to take a comprehensive approach to transportation demand management, or TDM, by recommending vehicle trip reduction goals for development throughout the city. So in doing so, we'll develop an ordinance to mitigate transportation effects of development. And by doing so, we'll be able to support citywide goals in our climate action plan and in our recently adopted general plan to encourage walking, bicycle use, and transit use, and a reduction in single occupancy vehicle trips. While there are regional policies that address transportation demand management, we wanted to take the opportunity to provide an ordinance and a program that's tailored to San Mateo's context while still being compliant with those regional policies. So to that end, local and regional context, within San Mateo, we have the Rail Corridor Transit-Oriented Development Plan, which many of you are familiar with. That's the area around our Hayward Park and Hillsdale Caltrain stations, where we do have a trip reduction target and projects are required to provide transportation demand management plans. We are all familiar with our recently adopted General Plan 2040, which contains transportation demand management policies, goals, and actions. We have language in our municipal code and in our transportation impact analysis guidelines around TDM. And then we have our locally adopted transportation plans like the Bike Master Plan and Pedestrian Master Plan that provide the basis for our active transportation in the city. In terms of regional and state contexts that guide the development of the TDM ordinance, we have State Bill 743. That's what implemented VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, as the transportation metric for CEQA analysis. Assembly Bill 2097, which came about in 2022, and that requires that, or implements that jurisdictions are no longer able to implement parking requirements around our high-quality transit areas, which for San Mateo is Caltrain. So those together really provided some state context in terms of our local ordinance. And then we have other input from Plan Bay Area 2050, MTC policy, and then CCAG's congestion management program and TDM policy, which is currently what guides TDM in the city outside of the rail corridor area. So we'll step through that just a little bit. So currently CCAG has a TDM policy that was implemented as of January 1st, 2022, that requires any development project within the jurisdiction of a city that is compliant with CCAG requirements to require TDM programs for any development that contributes 100 net new trips each day. So that means that it's looking at current trips, if it's an infill project, looking at current trips that are generated from that location, and then looking at the number of trips estimated from the new project. So in CCAG, in CCAG's TDM policy, that means any project where there's 100 new trips per day would be subject to that policy. As such, with a largely built-out city like San Mateo, where we have projects that are infill projects primarily, there are ones that may not be captured under the CCAG policy. When San Mateo has a city-specific policy, as we're discussing this evening, when adopted, we would be able to submit a request for exemption from the CCAG policy. So then projects within San Mateo would be following our local policy rather than CCAG. And we'll talk through some of the more specific requirements under CCAG a little bit later. With regard to General Plan 2040, the TDM ordinance is also in alignment with that recently adopted policy. So within that document, there's a goal around transportation demand management in looking to reduce the number and length of single occupancy vehicle trips. There's an accompanying policy regarding TDM requirements for new and existing developments, and then several actions that are related to transportation demand management, including a citywide TDM ordinance. So that really also provides basis and consistency for what we're going to be discussing this evening. So in terms of project approach, we've been working on this a little over a year, I think. This project is funded through a technical assistance grant from MTC, so we've been getting some great guidance from MTC, in addition to Matt and his team at Farron Piers, Nelson Nygaard, and Urban Planning Partners. So the work to date has included existing conditions review, basically what's going on in San Mateo and regionally and in the state as well. Looking at best practices in other cities with similar context to San Mateo and looking at what they're doing in terms of TDM there. And those documents were included as part of the staff report for your review. We've developed a policy framework that we discussed with Commission and with Council that really outlines the different components of the policy, and that provided the baseline for which we developed the proposed ordinance and policy manual that we'll be talking about tonight. At the same time, we did do community engagement with our stakeholder groups. We'll speak to that shortly, but to date, we've done 2 rounds of engagement with stakeholders. And as mentioned, we've visited both commissions and city council. And as for where we are today, we're crawling near the finish line. So we've just done our second round of community engagement. And developed the proposed TDM ordinance and draft policy manual. And that's the focus of our discussion this evening. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt, and he'll start off with our community feedback.
Great. Thank you, Sue Ellen, and thank you, commissions, for having us here today. So first, I'll start with our feedback. And so this is just a quick recap of what we've heard from the City Council and commissions. Really, a lot of focus on just clarity, making the program guidelines easy to implement, and focusing on the roadway safety and other infrastructure goals, as well as making it clear who would benefit from these measures and how the program would work. And so a lot of this feedback has been incorporated within our TDM program guidelines. We have also met twice now with the stakeholder groups, as Sue Ellen mentioned. And the focus of these meetings was first to understand what barriers that they face today in terms of implementing TDM and what opportunities they saw, and then following up with them to review the draft TDM program that you all are looking at today. And so some of the key things that we heard from them include just an appreciation of some of the added flexibility that this program will provide. As Sue Ellen mentioned, currently the CCAG TDM policy is what applies, and so this provides a little bit more flexibility, such as for affordable housing and providing more options for TDM as optional measures. They also requested, ways to make it easy to understand and to answer some of the key questions that you see listed below there within the program guidelines or program manual. So now I'm going to go through our draft TDM program. which is the culmination of our year plus worth of work. There's really two key outputs here. One is the TDM ordinance, and that is replacing the city's current 1980s and 90s ordinance that's been on the books and is a little outdated now, as you can imagine. And then there's the TDM policy manual, which really includes a lot of the details and about how this program will be implemented. And the purpose of the TDM policy manual is to provide administrative flexibility for the city staff to adjust as needed and make sure that it stays up to date as a living document. While the TDM ordinance is the enabling ordinance that creates the requirement that the city maintains this TDM policy manual. Both of these cover the applicability to different projects, what projects are exempt, which ones are applicable, the types of TDM that's required for different types of projects, compliance and enforcement, and the fees that will be required as well. And then there will also be additional resources that will be available, such as a checklist and a video to help staff and project applicants navigate the process easily. So there's really, when we're looking at the TDM program guidelines, there's really a kind of a 6-step process that any project applicant will go through. And so I'm going to step you through each of these to give you a sense of how this program would be applied. I'm going to focus first on just the different project characteristics and what projects apply and how that differs from CCAG, and then I'll go into the location, and then I'll give you some examples using the baseline and additional strategies. So first, currently, CCAG requirements use the concept of average daily traffic to determine the types of projects and categories for which TDM needs to be applied. And you'll see here that these are kind of approximate amounts, 20 to 49 dwelling units, for example, for small projects, and approximately 50 dwelling units for large projects. That's because trip generation analysis is needed to determine exactly what size of a project. And so that is typically done later in the development review process in the city of San Mateo. And so that's one of the opportunities for this program is to clarify and streamline that so there's more so project applicants and staff can understand at the beginning what types of TDM requirements there will be. So when we shift to how the project characteristics will be defined in the proposed program, you'll see a few changes. First, that small projects are defined as 26 to 49 units. That aligns with the city's other development review processes of what is defined as a small project. There's also exemptions that we're building into this based on your feedback. That includes projects with at least 50% affordable housing. Affordable units would be exempt from this program. That was some clear feedback that we received from you all, plus the council. There's also these two new categories of project types that are unclear within CCAG itself. That includes your existing non-residential uses, and that's something that we heard as feedback, wanting to incorporate some of these existing employers in town. And then secondly, for significant changes of uses. This is important for the city of San Mateo, since most of the development is redevelopment and infill, and CCAG only applies to net new trips. So if a new project generates less trips than the existing land use, such as building residential on a retail site, that project wouldn't have to implement TDM measures according to the CCAG's current policy. So this would capture those types of projects. Next, when we look at the geographic zones, this generally lines up with what CCAG requires today. There's really two main components as it applies to San Mateo. First, in the transit-oriented areas shown in Zone 1 in the blue, these are areas that generate, by the nature of the location, they generate less traffic for any kind of projects that are built in those areas than projects that are located in areas that have less transit, that have less walkable amenities, easy access to kind of the amenities and services that you do have within these blue areas. And so CCAG has defined lower thresholds for projects within those areas and higher, more intensive TDM measures outside of those blue areas. And so the city of San Mateo is going to continue that because you need to do more to reduce the same amount of traffic for those areas in Zone 2 and Zone 3. And so we also took into account the general plan redevelopment areas, since this is where most of the development is going to occur. And so we wanted to be clear about what the requirements are for both within the transit-oriented areas, within the general plan designated areas versus those redevelopment areas that are outside of that in your zone 2. I'll finally note that this TDM policy applies to the entire city. So those zone 3 areas, while they may not have much development anticipated, similar requirements would be applied there as in the zone 2 areas. So once a project has defined its characteristics and location to understand the applicability of this program, it will need to go in and understand what are the baseline required measures and which measures that it is available for it to select from an available menu. So when we look at what is required for CCAG today for this first example, which is in that zone 1 in the transit-oriented area, a large residential project, CCAG requires that developments provide things like a TDM coordinator, outreach materials, transit or rideshare passes and subsidies, and designing the streets around it to encourage bike and ped access. And then this project would also have to select from 14 other strategies. With this program in place, some of the names have changed to align with those general plan policies related to, for example, providing non-driving education, as well as implementing multimodal network improvements. So these are really clarifications to align the program with the city's existing procedures. We also took out those things that are already in the code because we didn't want to have redundant things in different parts of the code. So the secure bike storage was removed because that's already required for projects. And then we also added the unbundled parking costs and eliminating parking space minimums and leases. This aligns with that general plan policy to unbundle parking and make it so that developments don't require people pay for parking whether they use it or not. The other change that the program includes is increasing the number of measures that are available from a menu, providing more flexibility for developers from 14 to 26 for this residential multifamily large project. Next, I'm just going to give a brief example. This is a type of development that would not, or this is a type of land use that would not be captured under CCAG, and that is your existing non-residential use. And so the requirements would be pretty small because this is, an existing non-residential use, but we do want to bring it into the program and start to help provide pre-tax transportation benefits to employees. So this is for a small non-residential project, and then for a large one, you would also have the flexibility to, you'd have to gain 5 points, and I'll describe what those mean shortly. And so here is, when you're looking at the additional strategies that are required, this shows how for small projects there are less points are required in general, and for zone 1 versus zone 2 and 3, less points are going to be required for that transit-oriented area because, as I mentioned, people are already driving less in zone 1, and so therefore you need more higher requirements in zone 2 and 3 to kind of achieve those similar levels of reduction in driving. And so thinking back to that example that I talked about earlier, for a new residential land use, you would need to achieve 15 points if you're either that large project in zone 1 or if you're a small project in zone 2 or 3. And I'll continue to explain what these additional points, how you can get them in the next slide. But the second example I showed you, existing non-residential land uses for a small project would not have to achieve any additional points, while a large project would have to achieve 5 points. And so how do you achieve those points? So there's a whole menu of options, as I mentioned. We've increased the menu of strategies to include some of the latest options that are available, nationwide. And there's really 4 categories here: parking, services and programs, site enhancements, marketing, education, and management. And each of these has a page in the TDM program manual, so I'm not going to go through each one, but happy to answer questions if you do have specific questions. But just briefly, under parking, you can start to charge for parking and provide parking cash out. Services and programs, really your shuttle service is something that would provide a lot of value, particularly for those zone 2 and 3. The people that are going to live and work outside of the transit-oriented areas could really benefit from shuttle service as that additional measure. Site enhancements, doing things like consolidating delivery access, making it easier for people to kind of reduce the amount of trips that they do on a daily basis. And then marketing education, providing that additional level of education or training or real-time information to folks. So now that the project applicant has gone through the steps of identifying what the requirements are and selecting measures, they would need to submit documentation. And this is another step where we have tried to simplify things and align it with current city practices. So currently, a new development would need to prepare a TDM plan. This is generally the case. Sometimes it's optional. But a TDM plan generally includes writing existing conditions, describing the trip generation in order to determine what requirements there are, describing each of the TDM strategies and their implementation and effectiveness approach. And since a lot of the legwork that's described here has already been done as part of this program, going forward, there would just need to be a TDM checklist and then a description of how the strategy would be implemented within the project itself. And then you can also see for existing non-residential land uses, just a TDM checklist would be required, given the simplicity of that program and trying to streamline things for them. So now that we've gone through each of the steps, the project has been built, the TDM has been implemented, upon occupancy. Now comes the final monitoring, reporting, and compliance step. And so for this step, there's really four different categories of compliance that you could be in. The first one is for those projects that have been open for a while and things are going well. They only need to provide documentation and compliance every 3 years. So that's kind of the lowest level of effort. For projects, for land uses that are new or kind of getting their feet under them still, they would provide documentation every year just to demonstrate compliance that they're moving in the right direction. And then you have two categories of non-compliance. And for that orange category, they're still going to have to provide documentation every year, but they'll also need to provide a corrective TDM plan. How are they going to get back into compliance? And that generally is going to last for 2 to 3 years. One of the things we heard from the commissions and council was a desire to not have punitive actions right away. And so the final category is for those projects that have been consecutively non-compliant, kind of the serial non-compliant ones for 4+ years. That would be the stage where they'd have to demonstrate what their corrective TDM plan is and also would be subject to non-compliance penalties as well. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Sue Ellen, but happy to answer any questions when we get there.
All right, thanks, Matt. Okay, so that brings us to what's going to happen moving forward. So we're in April right now, and we're currently very happy to be reviewing this with both commissions tonight, and then we'll be bringing this information to City Council on Monday for a study session. And we'll take that additional feedback for incorporation into the draft ordinance to bring before you coming up in June. We're also at this time doing some fiscal analysis related to the TDM program measures. So there are required ones under CCAG as well, but we're looking at the fiscal impact for the city-specific recommended measures as well. Moving forward into May and June, we'll be finalizing those drafts and bringing both back to the City Council and commissions, and then pursuing ordinance adoption with the City Council. Following adoption, we'll be developing educational materials for our program moving forward. So that includes video information, website, and worksheet, et cetera, documentation for participants to use, developers, staff, et cetera, so that the implementation of the program is clear. And we'll share those materials with our stakeholder groups as well. All right, so that brings us back to this slide. So our reason for bringing both commissions together tonight is that each of you really provides different insight into the TDM ordinance. The Sustainability and Infrastructure Commission hears a lot about public works projects, of which this is one, and is focused on transportation, infrastructure, and sustainability in the city. And so that provides one perspective. Planning Commission hears from development projects as they're going through the planning application stage, during which when the ordinance is adopted, would be subject to the new requirements. And so we wanted to bring the two commissions together so that you can all provide feedback at the same time, but also hear each other's perspectives on this proposed policy. So we come back to the 4 questions. Since we're lucky enough to have 9 of you with us tonight, we would recommend that as you're going through feedback, that you go through the 4 questions one by one. So each commissioner can address all 4 questions at the same time with an eye for conciseness if possible, so that we can collate all of the feedback received. So again, the questions that we have for you this evening really relate to applicability of the TDM ordinance and if that seems reasonable, the required TDM measures for each project type and if those are appropriate to project types, the penalty structure that Matt just walked through in terms of compliance and monitoring, if that seems sufficient to induce compliance through measures of education and information gathering. And if the supplemental policy manual is clear regarding compliance with and implementation of the proposed policies. So with that, that concludes the staff presentation. Matt and I are available for questions, and we also have Rendell Bustos, our senior planner, on Zoom if there are any additional questions. Thank you for having us tonight.
Thanks to both of you for the very clear presentation. Before we go to public comment, are there any general questions by commissioners of staff at this point?
I might have some, yes. Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I have some questions on what are significant changes in use? Both, if you can give me specific examples from that would relate to this, and I'm particularly more interested in the small versus the large.
Significant changes in use are typically what you would see in a tenant improvement project. For example, along Fashion Island Boulevard near the Bridgepoint Shopping Center, there's a large project that's doing tenant improvements. So it's utilizing the same shell that was there previously. So it's not tearing down and redeveloping, at which point it would be a new project. It's really the interior redesign to go from one use to another. Or we might see that in the downtown on a much smaller scale, of course, going from one use to another within the same shell. So it's not redeveloping the actual building, it's doing the improvements on the interior to change uses.
Right. So let me take that one step further. Let's say we're looking at a residential complex and a landlord would like to do some improvements for their tenants. Would that be included in this
No.
definition? Okay.
No.
So it's and I know what you mean in terms of the example you've given me. They're constantly interior. Okay, so residential, if I'm a property owner and whether I'm of a small or large and I want to do some improvements for my tenants, it could be electrification, it could be removal of walls, structural, whatever that is, that would not trigger a TDM.
No, something along a similar vein may be if an office building were being reutilized to become housing, for example. But if you're a property manager and you're doing tenant improvements in individual existing housing units and their remaining housing units, that would not be a change in
Whether
use.
it's an individual unit or a multi-family or a multi-unit. And here's why I'm asking this question is I want to make sure that whatever we do, you and I spoke that we don't want to disincentivize businesses from doing work in San Francisco, nor do we want to de-incentivize the building of new projects. Likewise, I'm sensitive to de-incentivizing landlords who want to make improvements for their tenants. And so that's the genesis of my question. And I just want to hear and if we don't know, a definitive nope, if a landlord, regardless of the size of their unit, wants to make improvements for their tenants, that this doesn't trigger a TDM.
That would not, because it
Okay.
would be the land use is housing, for example, in your example that you're using.
Right.
And if a landlord is making improvements like electrification or removing walls or something like that, the use is still housing.
Right.
So it's not a change in use.
Okay, it's not a change in use. Okay, thank you. And then also, too, under existing non-residential users, we have 2 buckets of 25 to 99 employees and greater than 100 employees. I can think of circumstances where companies of roughly 30 people, it's not very large, do not have or provide pre-tax transportation benefits. What happens in that situation within the TDM? Because that's one of the requirements for that cohort of existing non-residential users.
For a business with 30 employees.
Yeah, if they don't have pre-tax transportation benefits, what happens?
Under this ordinance, they would be required to provide that for their employees. So they would be required to work with their payroll company to implement that option.
Right. I can share with you, some of the restaurants may not have this in place. After you and I spoke, I went down to my little taqueria and I spoke with them. They didn't even know what I was talking about. But, I'm also sensitive to small businesses as well. And I think that could be a big ask. So, but you've answered my question there. I'll save some comments. I'm going to just bring it up now. And my fellow commissioners can appreciate what I'm going to, my fellow sustainability commissioners are going to appreciate what I'm going to say here. But, we just went through a very detailed training on hearing small cell appeals from residents. Now, and the training was very good. Staff did a great job. But one of the things that came out was clarity. It was very, very clear what we can and cannot rule on within the context of an appeal. And so in the plan here, you have something what I would say is similar to an appeal. It goes to the Planning Commission. And a developer needs an exemption or a modification. And in there, you talk about impractical, in the plan, it talks about impractical uses. What would be some of those examples? Because where I'm going to go with this, and I'll save it for my comments and in response to your question, is this has to be very specific, I believe, for the Planning Commission. Because this is essentially an appeal. So if you could just...
Do you know the page number that you're referring to when you are asking?
Sure. I'm just looking at, let me just get this here. Let's see, I see baseline submitted. Let me just see. Yeah, I see your modifications to approved is done by the Planning Commission. Let me get you that page later. I'll find that for you.
That'd be great, thank you.
But that, I think, is going to be key to make this as efficient and productive for both the applicant as well as the Planning Commission. But let me get that page for you a little bit later. Maybe somebody else has got some questions here.
Through the chair. You're looking at page 6 of the policy manual, Susan.
Is it page 6? Thank you. I see 7. Thanks. Is that Kimmy? Thank you. So under exemptions and modifications, that's page 6. It talks about the burden is on the developer to show there is a significant hardship. A significant hardship is defined as practical infeasibility or the end result inconsistent with the purposes of these guidelines. Hardship exemption shall be granted in unusual circumstances. I think that's exceedingly broad, but I don't know what it means. So what's an example of practical infeasibility?
So that would include something like, requiring modification of a building, for example, in some way. Like, this is something that we could definitely look into and look at how else the city of San Mateo uses this type of terms. Like, this is fairly standard language that we've seen elsewhere, but we understand that there's,
Sure. And Matt knows in great detail our training and what we went through, and I think can appreciate the level of detail and training to the planning commissioners. So it's just done quickly, efficiently, and everybody wins. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Seema?
Through the chair, you asked if we have general questions. I have very specific questions. Would you prefer to hold those until after public comment or do them now?
Will you be able to bring them into the conversation with the 4 specific questions that staff is asking us?
No, they are more specific than that.
Then why don't you go for it?
Okay, thank you. You know me.
I hope there's numbers.
There are. Okay. P7 is a parking strategy that says eliminate parking space minimum requirements in leases. This was covered in the presentation. I was curious, is this very common in San Mateo to have parking space minimum requirements in leases? I didn't see it mentioned in the existing conditions.
I can't speak to whether it's common here, but it's one of those evolving type of measures that is new because it is, it's one way to get around unbundled parking.
Oh, okay, great. My next question is about S4, provide ride matching services. I was curious if you could explain what a ride matching service is. If you look in the appendix on page 32, the description is the same as the previous page for the school pool. So I wasn't quite sure what a ride matching service meant.
Sure. I believe Commissioner Wiggins brought that to our attention as well. S3, school pool services, that's ride matching for the school commute. As for ride matching services, there have been some specific apps that have been available and promoted, for example, by commute.org. But basically, it's to break it down entirely, it's a matchmaking service for ride matching. And if you're looking for a carpool, you put in where you're going from, where you're going to, what days, what times, and it finds you a match for a carpool.
Thank you. I know what you're talking about. My husband actually uses an app like that. So my next question is about E1, which is implement multimodal network improvements. And I think this question might be a little bit similar to what Chair Ruinski was asking. I had 2 questions about this one. This has come up a lot in Planning Commission meetings where we have, I think, asked in the past if we can require a project to make multimodal improvements. And I feel like, I might be misremembering, but I feel like in the past the answer has been we can't require a developer to make changes to public right-of-way because that is not property that they own. So I guess I have a sort of philosophical question in how can we require this? Is it because it's optional and not a hard requirement that we're allowed to do that?
So really the focus here, and keep in mind that we're translating a CCAG requirement which says provide bike and ped access around the project site, but in practical terms has could be checked off if someone provides a 5-foot sidewalk, for example, which wouldn't meet the city of San Mateo's requirements. So really the intent of this is that for your basic required measures, it is meeting the city of San Mateo's standard sidewalk design guideline, project frontage type improvements. And then you would get additional points for providing additional improvements beyond that.
I see. Okay, so, and I did note that we are requiring it of residential projects, but not non-residential ones, so that'll come up later in comments. I was just curious, given some of the specific examples that talk about protected bike lanes that feel like they're in the right of way, how we might be able to require that, which leads me to my second question. How is it determined what is a sufficient quantity of improvements to meet the requirement? Because the language in that requirement is quite broad. Is that up to the transportation demand manager to say, yes, you've met this requirement, you get your 5 points or you get your 10 points?
I think that it would be a discussion between the city and the applicant. Typically, that would be improvements along the frontage. So I think in terms of being not enough, it would maybe be, 5 feet or something like that.
Right.
If they are making the improvements along the frontage or on the block, then that would be something that would meet the requirements for that. But I think that would be a discussion with the applicant in terms of how they are aiming to meet that goal.
Okay, great. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for a great presentation. So I have some broad questions. So Ellen, you said that the goal is like 15% trip reduction, less traffic than existing land uses. That's like the top line goal of this TDM ordinance. How did the 15% figure come to pass?
So that's in the TDM measures are keyed, and the point values are keyed to meet the city's VMT reduction goals, vehicle miles traveled goals, and sorry,
It's okay. It's okay.
That was developed during the Transportation Impact Analysis Guidelines development that was completed in, I think, 2020-ish or so. And that was when SB 743 first came into effect, where the cities, where the requirement for transportation analysis under CEQA moved to vehicle miles traveled. The city developed their specific requirements in terms of transportation analysis and evaluated what the city's threshold would be for congestion reduction moving into the future. And so the determination was for the city, the goal was 15% reduction in VMT as compared to existing land uses.
And is there a baseline year for that? Is 2020 the baseline year, or?
I would have to look into that and get back to you.
Because that does matter, right? Pandemic, peak pandemic versus pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic actually does impact how significant 15% is.
In a matter of speaking, it may. That's the metric and the threshold that we are using across the board. So when we're looking comparatively, I think that it evens out, but in terms of baseline year, I would have to get back to you on that.
Okay, so the 15% is fixed, and essentially the TDM ordinance that we're working on together now is an effort to help implement that goal, but that goal is actually fixed right now for the city?
I can answer that. CCAG hasn't updated any of their transportation data to reflect post-pandemic conditions yet.
So these are pre-pandemic conditions, 15% reduction off of that.
Yeah, and that's pretty standard for what most cities are evaluating these days.
So why did East Palo Alto and Redwood City have 40% and 50% as their targets?
Sure. Our metric that we're looking at is vehicle miles traveled. The trip reduction, when you're talking about 40%, is based on trip generation estimates, and those are different calculations, basically.
Those are also a bit more aspirational. So, when we're talking about how much reduction you can actually get, like what is actually feasible, when you look at how people travel downtown Redwood City, for example, kind of the best you get is maybe like a 30 to 35, maybe 40% reduction. Once you get outside of that area, Google, Facebook and Google with their very robust transit systems that they run privately, that's about the same as well. So pretty much anywhere else on the peninsula, you're typically, with a TDM program, you're talking like a 15 to 20% reduction is like really the maximum that you're going to be able to get without kind of implementing, kind of massive requirements or concentrating your land uses only within a really walkable transit downtown.
Okay, great. And then the exemption of 50% affordable units being exempted, where did that come from?
I can start to answer that, and then I may ask Rendell Bustos to chime in on that as well. We had wanted to provide exemption for affordable housing, and at first had looked at offering the exemption for 100% affordable housing. And in looking at the percentage of housing units that are typically offered as affordable, we wanted to make sure that we weren't limiting it too much or basically eliminating projects that may be offering affordable housing as well, because we wanted to ensure that we were supporting the production of affordable housing.
Sorry, so I have a clarifying question though then, like why would we want to exempt affordable housing? And insofar as folks who live in affordable housing disproportionately may be using public transit already, and so essentially trying to achieve TDM is more challenging, or is TDM then seen as a burden to those landlords? Or, there's an assumption there that I'm trying to unpack, because I think a lot of the times city ordinances exempt affordable housing thinking that that's a blessing to the affordable housing, where in fact it just starts to leave affordable housing tenants and residents behind. So I'm really trying to understand the actual policy impact and reasons for this exemption.
Understand that entirely. And that's certainly not a unforeseen consequence that we want to have here. In terms of TDM measures, the impetus in exempting affordable housing is that affordable housing developers don't typically have the additional margin by which to provide additional site plan amenities or additional measures for their future residents, whereas for-profit developers tend to be able to do so more often. And so in not wanting to you put an additional burden on affordable housing and hinder the development of affordable housing in the city, we didn't want to add additional costs to the development of those projects.
What is the marginal cost of these kinds of projects, like these kinds of programs for an affordable housing developer? Because I also understand the way that they create a capital stack looks different, correct? So I'm getting out of my zone here, Planning Commission, sorry. But I'm just really trying to understand, because from an impact perspective, that still does not solve. We are in fact going to leave people behind then. Because if the assumption is that in fact, no, the folks who live in affordable housing units do not disproportionately already have these benefits from some other forum or some other resource, then the actual end result impact of this exemption is that the residents will not be able to benefit from TDM measures, but then at market rate, folks will, which just then perpetuates the chronic inequity that we see in climate policy. No?
Understood. Matt,
Is that what am I missing? I'm sorry if I'm being dense.
No, you're not at all. This is the debate that we have continued to have, and we've had certainly with our stakeholders. There's what other communities are starting to investigate now is other ways to fund, create funding mechanisms. For example, CCAG is now looking at a VMT mitigation program around the county that would then provide money for community travel planning, kind of TDM type coordinators that could go into existing and future affordable housing projects, funding transit passes, all those types of measures. We heard pretty clearly from the affordable housing developers that we did interview that this is just one of those things that could create additional barriers for them to actually build the housing. So that's the trade-offs are very much there. There could be policy ways to fund these measures elsewhere if this continues.
Okay, great. And my last question though then is, for the 4 years, you have 4 years until you start to accrue fines. Is that normal, that 4 year window of grace period, let's call it? Like, are there other San Mateo ordinances that have that length of a grace period? Are there other TDM ordinances that you looked at that have that grace period? I tried to look at the example case studies, but I couldn't quite discern where this stacks up.
I can answer in terms of San Mateo and then look for Matt to fill in on other jurisdictions. In the rail corridor TOD area, if you're out of compliance, that is not meeting your trip reduction goal, you need to work with the city and add additional TDM measures to hopefully make your trip reduction goal the next year. So there is not a grace period such as that in San Mateo. I will say that that was built into the proposed policy based on feedback from City Council, who across the board favored what they were terming a 3 strikes option. They didn't want to have a policy that was overly punitive and wanted to focus on education and compliance.
But on the 3rd strike, you're out, not the 4th, right?
So I hear.
Okay.
But we did want to build in that opportunity to provide education and to work with the entity so that it is not seen as a burden and it's something that we're able to offer to our future residents and tenants.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sorry. Great presentation. Thanks. One question really, which is just, and I may be missing it, so I'm looking for the flexibility in TDM programs. I did see a reference in the policy manual, page 134 in the whole big process, is where a TDM program manager, who I'm not totally clear who that is, can a developer, stakeholder can propose a change in their TDM, compliance. But so I was trying to get a handle on how that works, not only for new technologies or things that evolve, but just learning curve. That okay, these strategies, look good, and we gave all these points for them. But it turns out that there's something completely different that works for that location. How do they kind of dovetails a little bit off something Susan was talking about? Who do they talk to? Is the ordinance, are they going to have to amend the ordinance, or is there a process where a senior staff person, the director of public works, or somebody can make these deltas, these changes?
We have built-in flexibility in terms of technology changes. Agreed, we learn as we go, frankly, for most things that we're doing. And we do have an option that if a project or applicant has a TDM measure that they would like to implement, that they can suggest that. And then the city, we can tighten that up and make that, for example, Public Works Director or their designee can approve that as a substitute TDM strategy. But to the larger point, when a draft ordinance comes before you, you'll see it's very bare bones. And really the ordinance lays out the ability to have a TDM requirement and points to the policy manual for all of the really specific information, including the TDM measures that a project can implement. And we've done that specifically so that if we want to update the list of TDM measures, update the point targets, update the compliance and monitoring, et cetera, that we do not have to amend the Muni Code to do that. So the ordinance is very bare bones, just serves to implement the fact that we have a TDM requirement and how that program functionally exists. Mm-hmm. And then the TDM policy manual contains all of the detailed information so that we can edit that and update that administratively. It's a much easier process that way.
Makes perfect sense, but who has the authority to make those changes, the policy?
We can make that more.
Anticipate
we anticipate the Public Works Director or their designee.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening. I have a couple of questions as well. Great job on the presentation and really making that entire report much clearer. I'm sorry if I missed this, but does CCAG have penalties in their program?
CCAG does not currently have penalties in their program.
Great. And then I was also wondering about the monitoring fee. Is that something that would be paid per monitoring cycle?
It is anticipated that it would be an annual fee that would be submitted with the report. In terms of the fee, that's something that we're looking at moving into the draft, and those fees may be modified.
So if a project needs to report every 3 years, they would pay that fee every 3 years or every year?
It would be submitted with the monitoring report. So if they're on a less frequent monitoring cycle, it would be less frequent. The intent of the fee is to offset, make the process cost neutral, so offsetting staff time. And it's likely that we may coordinate with commute.org to assist with monitoring, and so associated costs for their staff.
Yeah, that segues into my next question and also hits on the public comment we got. If you could describe a little bit about what monitoring looks like, and would commute.org take it over?
We do have some items that would have to be worked out after adoption of the ordinance in terms of the monitoring in that first year that the ordinance would be in place. Right now, commute.org is working with CCAG to provide the monitoring for the CCAG program, and they've indicated that they would be available to help us with that as well. But the monitoring would consist of submitting the compliance report and then reviewing that.
Great, thank you. And then my last comment was also similar about the affordable housing. It seems that affordable housing shouldn't miss out on some of these amenities, and maybe they could also be assigned some point system that developers need to reach, and that would help take care of like the lower cost ones minimal cost ones versus the higher cost ones, but that those residents would also be supported for alternative modes of transportation. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks. We can provide that feedback to City Council for policy direction.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I just have really one question, because lots of my questions or my other questions have been brought up, such as the exemption for affordable housing. Although it's kind of an interesting point of discussion, because I also agree with the comment that was made about the difficulty on small businesses to do the pre-tax benefit. I've worked in small businesses. I've owned a small business, and so that's an interesting point, I think, of discussion as well. Anyway, my question is, as I was reading the items, I forget which item they are, but the bike repair workshop and the bike skill and safety workshop items, I was wondering, how has the success rate of those been in other jurisdictions? And, are they practical and feasible, and how are they monitored? It's a great idea. I just wonder, with people's busy lives, do people attend those?
It's worth 1 point. So we're trying to make that an option available, for a developer if that's something that they want to provide for as a service. But yeah, we recognize that it's not the most effective measure.
Mm-hmm. And how is that monitored? I mean, do they have to just...
It's similar to any other measure. You need to submit compliance that you did, particularly for marketing outreach. You need to show, hey, we did this program. We advertise this to residents, that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you. That's all I had.
Chair. Plenty of excellent questions already asked. A couple of small ones on, just while we're talking about the monitoring, it sounds like the monitoring is self-monitoring. Is that correct?
You need to demonstrate compliance. It's self-monitoring from the perspective of you have to gather all the information, and demonstrate that you've actually done the things that you said you were going to do and submit that to the city staff that are going to review that.
Yep, okay. That's what I thought. Just want to double check. And I asked this in a question, but just as a clarification, the non-compliance fines are annual, levied annually if you're non-compliant in the red zone.
Yes, that's the anticipation.
Okay. And just one follow-up on something that Chair Rowinski was asking about. For that small business with 30 employees, does something trigger them needing to implement that, the pre-tax transit benefit? Or is it like the day this ordinance is in effect, there'll be a large mailing that you'll be preparing that goes out to a lot of businesses? Is it like that?
What we've seen in other jurisdictions is that they implement requirements for existing employers at the renewal of the business license. So it would be up to the purview of City Council if we do that the first year, or if we take the first year to do education and then implement it. But for example, for the smaller existing employers, the pre-tax transportation benefits, providing information about how to work with your payroll provider to make that available to your employees.
Okay. Thank you. Those are all my questions.
Thank you all. A couple questions for staff. Commute.org, one of their comments or considerations were consider layering the land use type plus project size with TDM ordinance and 3 tiers of geography in San Mateo. What would be the benefit of that if it were included in the measure?
I assume that, I haven't seen this comment, but I assume by 3 tiers of geography they are referring to. So their CCAG does have 3 tiers. We only applied 2 because all of San Mateo is within 3 miles of the Caltrain stations. You might cut the very, very edge of the western border of the city of San Mateo, but the point being is that there's 3 categories in CCAG. It's 0 to 1/2 mile, 1/2 mile to 3 miles, and greater than 3 miles. So that greater than 3 miles category, there's really no substantive land uses within San Mateo that would fall within that.
So it wouldn't
apply.
to
Yeah,
that.
so that's why we just dropped that for simplicity.
Okay. And per MTC's comments, one of them was that they recommend having minimum required and allowed residential and/or commercial office densities for new development. So are we looking at minimums?
I'm sorry, would you be able to reference where
It
you're...
says minimum required and allowed residential and/or commercial office densities for new development.
Would you be able to reference a page number or what document you're looking at?
I wish I could. Yes, it's page 6 of 19, dated March 23rd, 2023. It was part of the stakeholder conversations.
Got it. Okay, I'm going to dig for that, but one thing to keep in mind, so this does not change zoning code, but the city of San Mateo does have minimum densities, or will have to at some point be compliant with MTC's TOC policy, transit-oriented communities policy, which sets minimum densities for transit-oriented areas.
They do. When does that come into effect?
So the transit-oriented communities policy, and I wonder if Manira wants to take that. Thank you.
To the chair, good evening, everyone. Manira Sandhir, planning manager. So the TOC policy, the transit-oriented communities policy, is adopted by MTC, but it isn't yet a requirement for all cities to adopt. However, if cities adopt it, it does open up grant funding for the city. So we have been looking at the TOC policy closely. I know we were in the throes of having our general plan adopted, and now when we transition to doing our zoning code amendments, then we will be closely looking at that to establishing minimum densities in those TOD areas. So no set date yet for our local adoption yet.
Okay, thank you. No problem. I can ask you another question if you,
We're impressed by the depth that you reviewed. Go ahead and answer the other question, and we'll make sure to clarify.
well, we don't get many shots at this, and it's, Public Works is really a lot of fun. We love to get Sue Ellen on the stage here. There's, oh my goodness, page 11 of 12 from the TDM Policy Framework Memorandum. And it states that, in summary, that most communities are going for the 15% reduction from their baseline, which I believe every city was able to determine what their baseline was independently at that time. So, but the state has also said that in 2022, ARB scoping plan update and indicated California may now need to reduce their VMT from 25 to 30% because we are losing ground in our greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So why would we not go to 30 if 15 does not seem to be bringing us the benefit that we were hoping?
Yes. So California Air Resources Board said we are going the wrong direction on VMT reduction. VMT continues to increase across the state. And they, in their scoping plan, which is the plan that says, here's how we achieve our climate target, which is carbon neutrality by 2045 as a state, we are going to need to reduce our statewide VMT by 30%. It leaves, now there's another statewide agency called the Office of Planning and Research that created the rules relating to VMT for use in CEQA, and they said 15% is a reasonable amount of reduction that balances kind of both citywide kind of ability to build housing and other land uses and meet our statewide targets. Now, OPR has not issued new guidance based on California Air Resources Board 30% reduction. The 30% reduction is statewide. It's not targeted towards any individual jurisdiction. If the city of San Mateo wanted to reflect that 30% reduction, there's climate action plan kind of considerations that the city should be thinking about. So there's a complexity, to say the least. It's not a recommendation for what any individual jurisdiction should do, but certainly some kind of more climate-focused cities are thinking about that, how to achieve 30% reductions. That being said, if you do the math, what this TDM ordinance is targeted at is to get your minimum compliance that's consistent with the city of San Mateo's current policies of 15% below. You're going to get quite a bit higher than that for your transit-oriented areas, for example. As I mentioned to Commissioner Narita, kind of your downtown environments are going to generate less VMT to begin with, and when you're layering on the TDM requirements that are presented here, you're going to definitely get closer to that 30% reduction there. And so concentrating new development with these TDM policies, you're going to start to pursue that path. But this is a lot more of a discussion than just a TDM ordinance update.
Okay.
Through the chair, if I could also add, as we were discussing with Commissioner Robbins, the nature of the policy manual being separate from the ordinance does give us flexibility to update in the future. So if at such time OPR does modify the 15% recommendation to something that's a higher threshold, and we adopt that locally in our transportation impact analysis guidelines, for example, we can come back and modify what's in our policy manual. But what's before you tonight is consistent with what we're doing in other processes in the city.
Great. Sue, do you still, or you have another question?
Sue Ellen, just another question here. You had a stakeholder group with developers. Who showed up on the developer side?
I'd have to look back specifically. I believe.
I just need to know the name, not who, but the developer. Bohannon, Culligan, Essex?
I believe representatives from Bohannon, Mid-Penn. Oh, slipping my memory at this point. Matt, do you have any other updates? We can look that up and get back to you if needed.
Yeah, it's in our packet material somewhere here. I'm looking for it.
Sure, I did find, I saw a kind of a brief summary of it. Then as Matt is looking at that, Sue Ellen, I do have another final question here under project thresholds, project types. You know, you had shared, I had a question on significant changes in use. There's also something called building additions, and it looks like it starts at about 10,000 square feet. So if I'm a landlord and I want to add some units, or I want to expand some space for my tenants, but let's say it's 20,000 square feet. Does that trigger a TDM?
That still would not be consistent with a change in use, but if you're adding 20,000 square feet to an existing building, I think that is a specific context that I would have to
Sure, yeah.
consider.
Yeah, and once again, going back to, I just want to make sure landlords are given the flexibility and the opportunity to work with their tenants. And I don't want something, you know, the TDM itself is not super onerous, but, you know, people just look at what the requirements are, and if the list is long, they don't do it. They're not going to spend a lot of time looking into what the details are, but the list is long, they're just not going to do that.
Understood.
Yeah, so, you know, it says significant changes in use or building additions. You know, maybe you add the word existing non-residential to this or something.
We can consider that, just keeping in mind that an addition of, for example, 20,000 square foot to a housing unit or to a housing complex would be somewhere in the range of 15 to 20 additional housing units. And so that would likely fall under the significant change of use because they are substantially adding to the number of housing units that are at that location.
Right, okay, so, all right, then that goes back to my earlier question is change of use is not only a change of use, but it could be a material addition.
We can make that more clear. To your prior question on attendees from the developer focus group, we had representatives from MidPenn, Harvest, Wilson Meany, Bohannon, Lane Partners, Saris Regis, Bridge Housing, and I think that covers both of them.
Okay. Overall, what was their reception? What kind of feel did you get? I read the bullets, but it doesn't tell me the feel, the vibe.
The representatives for affordable housing were concerned about the ability to financially afford these measures if there were not an exemption. Developers for market rate housing and non-residential uses, similar concerns about cost, but acknowledge that the majority of the more costly measures are already required under CCAG requirements. So I think it was generally around cost, implementation. There was a question and clarification on what each measure would require, which we've done further in our draft policy manual. And then requests for education about how to implement and very clear materials.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Any other questions from commissioners? So can we go to public comment, please?
If you're on Zoom and you want to comment, please raise your hand at this time. Chair Ebnetter, we have no public commenters.
Thank you very much. We'll close the public comment period and bring it back to the commission to look at the 4 bullet items, please. And you are not restricted to only commenting on the 4 items. If you have other information that you would like to introduce, please do so. I don't know, so Sue Ellen, you feel that it would be best that each item was addressed individually rather than all 4 by a commissioner?
Through the chair, I think it may be more efficient if each commissioner responds to all 4 at one time, and then we can take notes on that. Unless you prefer to do it otherwise,
I was
it's
confused.
entirely up to you.
I was confused. So each commissioner can run through each item at once. Okay. Well, that's fine. Does anybody want to volunteer to go first? Please.
Not the shyest commissioner, so sure. Pretty straightforward. Let's see. I'll go in order. Item 1, the threshold, the reasonableness of the thresholds and the requirements. I'm going to just say generally yes. I'm not going to micromanage. I do note that it was particularly helpful to see the stakeholder input. Too often we kind of work off of what we see in other cities or what we would like, and without necessarily thinking about all the impacts. But having worked with Sue Ellen now for many years, I'm not surprised. This, I think, very well done. So that's a general yes. Item 2, the question 2, are the TDM measures appropriate? I'm quite frankly, and you may recall from a year ago, I'm pretty skeptical about the perceived efficacy of some of these in the real world, particularly when you get out into Zone 3, where it's just very limited. I will, a quick editorial note, I love that you have Arlington as an example. I lived there for years. I was a member of the Democratic Committee there, and we're nothing like Arlington. So, not to mention Atlanta and everything else. It's just really tough. We just don't have some of those options. But so I'm a bit skeptical, but I'm going to say a yes generally, and it's because of what you said in response to my earlier question about the flexibility in the structure where you're going to have the policy manual and the ability for presumably senior staff or some process to adjust those required measures and options. 3, a little tougher for me, are the penalties sufficient? Probably not. But at the same time, I recognize and probably support as if they needed it. Let's say I'll just respect City Council's desire to not be punitive. And to be fair, I've always been a much bigger fan of an incentives regime, which is not what we have. So, without tossing the whole thing upside down and building in big incentives, I think it's probably the best we can do to have the penalties the way we are without basically chasing developers out. I mean, I love the general plan references. A number of us here were on the general plan subcommittee, which I ended up chairing near the end. And it's, we build in all the things that we can, but at the end of the day, if we want to see more housing, affordable and otherwise, it's got to pencil out. So I think this element, this piece, keeping the penalties where they are, seems about right to me. Lastly, a much shorter answer. I think the policy manual is excellent. So yes, it's clear, at least it was to me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Through the chair. Just from building off what Commissioner Robbins was referencing with the general plan, and it's still fresh in my mind, some of the really excellent policies in the circulation element. And I have to say, at a high level, I'm pretty excited about this because I'm eager to see us move forward and take all the steps we can. Some big, some small, some tentative, some might not work out, some might work better than others, to try and shift mode share and get more people out of cars if they're in a car, for it to be a shorter vehicle mile trip. And so I'm kind of in favor of an all the above approach to try to move that forward. So I'm broadly really supportive. Just to go through the 4 questions, the thresholds and requirements for the projects, I'd asked this question and it was already addressed in the presentation. To have thresholds based just on units or on square footage depending on what type of land use where you are in the city, they're not going to generate trips equally. But if you think about the alternative, is you would have to do all this analysis to find out where the threshold should be on every project basis. It seems impractical. So what I like about this is that it is clear. I don't actually know if it's quite right, but it's a starting place, and I definitely trust the professionals that research to look into it. So I do like that it's clear. People can understand up front which lane they're getting slotted into, and they can work from there. I still think this is going to have pain points along the way, and commissioners have brought up some of them, but it gets so complex when you get into each of the weeds. Each of these different measures and types of approaches has its own aspect of weeds. So I think it's a good place to start. Are the measures appropriate for the project type? Yes, I'm a big fan of how broad the menu is. There's we haven't really talked much about the measures, but parking cash out, bicycle library, some of the items in here, I think we're tackling it from a lot of different ways. And so again, I'm supportive of that and believing that when staff gets a few years of data trying to implement this, you'll be able to amend and adjust, I think. But you'll be able to try out a lot of things with this broad menu. So I'm supportive of that. The penalty structure, I also don't know if it's enough. I think the question to ask in a way is, would it cost the landowner more to comply or to just pay the fee? So if you're a large project and you're $25,000 per point and you would have had to, I think you have to, maybe 20 points was for a large project, if I'm remembering the right category. It could be $500,000 a year. But then again, it was 20 points. Could you have done 20 points worth of stuff for less than again, that's hard to know. So I don't know if it's sufficient, but it feels big enough to make people think about it. So I'll give you a thumbs up for that, I think. And the supplementary policy manual, I think it's pretty clear. I go back and try to imagine someone going through this process. I still think they'll have a ton of questions, but I think there's no way around that because there's too much. All the development projects we see coming through here, there's just too much minutia, for lack of a better word, for you to anticipate all of that in the manual. So I think it's enough to let someone read it and come in and have a productive meeting and work with you on it. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Through the chair.
Please.
I'm going to be a little bit different. I think my comments are a bit more specific, but I'll also go in order. So starting at thresholds and requirements, I think generally what we saw on the table, page 5, table 1 is great, but there were a couple of things I wanted to discuss. I had a similar question to Chair Rowinski about the significant changes in use and when that is triggered versus when the addition requirement is triggered. So hypothetical, if you were to add 5,000 square feet to a site that takes the residential unit count from 20 units to 26 units, it's under the size requirement that would trigger a TDM, but it is changing the number of residential units from exempted to small, or maybe small to large. So I was curious how that kind of interplay happens.
As written right now, that would, in practice, not trigger a requirement because it is an existing complex that's adding less than the amount of square footage that would trigger implementation of the TDM.
Even
ordinance.
though the number of units would now trigger a TDM.
Correct, because the number of units is the threshold for new projects.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. So 2 comments on that applicability then. One, I have very similar concerns that have already been raised by Vice Chair Narita around the exemption of 50% affordable or more housing projects. I don't think that was discussed when it came before Planning Commission, because I feel like we would have had a really robust conversation about it. Car ownership decreases with income. People who are lower income are less likely to own cars. And so I worry that by exempting affordable housing projects, we are exempting the community that would benefit the most from these measures. And I think Vice Chair Narita said it way more eloquently than I could. Just that I have very big concerns about perpetuating inequities in that way, to have market rate housing have more amenities than our affordable housing. And I can understand completely the nonprofit developers' concerns about the added cost to those projects and how that would make those projects more difficult or potentially even cause some of those projects not to pencil. But I feel like there needs to be some more discussion about this, probably at the city council level, because I would hate to see us exempting the community that would benefit the most from these measures. The other thing I noticed is that existing residential uses are not listed, even though existing commercial uses are. And I'm sure there was a good reason for that, but we haven't discussed it. So I would, if other commissioners would like to talk about it, on first blush to me, it seems like we should include existing residential units, particularly the large projects, because I imagine those projects would benefit a lot from TDM measures and would contribute significantly to a reduction in vehicle miles traveled. I actually don't know how long the CCAG has been in effect, so maybe some of those projects are already covered by the existing requirements, but if we have any older projects that would benefit, I think it would be a good idea to include them. Are the required TDM measures for each project type appropriate? So this is when I went through and I read all of the TDM measures and I had comments on some of them. And so I guess I'll just try to go through this quickly. At a really high level, I wonder if we have enough strategies to really give our larger projects flexibility to achieve their point totals. I was just looking at some of the point totals and the math, and the large projects have to get to 20 points, and it's really hard to get to 20 points unless you implement one of like the very big things, like a shuttle program. And so it might be worth looking at again and just making sure that we have enough flexibility for the large projects, and we're not really, your choice is a shuttle program or, some significant bike lane additions. Page 11, table 5, P1. I have a note here that I asked, why wouldn't non-residential projects have shared parking? Shouldn't this be a requirement for all non-residential projects? So I think it's not a requirement right now, but perhaps it should be. P3, reduce on-site vehicle parking. Given AB 2097, which I think covers a sizable portion of the city, I'm not sure if this would be an effective strategy, because I think you've got one of two cases. Either some developers who financiers are supportive of this will immediately take advantage of this and not provide on-site parking because it's a substantial cost to a project. Or what we hear from developers is that their financing agreements require them to provide a certain amount of on-site parking, and so they won't take advantage of this because they can't, because of their financing agreements. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm not really sure if this strategy is really a choice. I feel like it's going to be one or the other. P4, charge for on-site parking. I actually think this should be a requirement across the board. I agree with Donald Shoup, who's a professor at UCLA of land economics, transportation, and parking, when he says, quote, advocating for ride sharing while offering free parking is like denouncing smoking while offering free cigarettes. We will never reduce traffic congestion, air pollution, and energy consumption if we continue to offer free parking and call it transportation demand management. So I think we should consider making that a requirement. P5, provide a parking cash out option. I think employers, if they subsidize parking, are already required to do this by California state law. AB 2109 passed in 1992 requires this. And so it's not required in the table. There might need to be some nuanced language there to say if they're providing subsidized parking, then this actually is required. Page 12, table 6, S4. Oh, you already answered my question there on what a ride matching service is. S9, providing an on-site bike library. So this came up, I think, in a planning commission meeting maybe a year or two ago, where been reading about some new residential projects, not in San Mateo, where as an amenity, developers are providing an e-bike to each unit. And that's such a cool idea, and feels like such a great strategy. But the points total offered by this on-site bike library is not very high. And so I just want to make sure that there's a way, if a developer were to come in with some really creative idea that technically meets this requirement, but is really going way above and beyond what is required, that they can get points commensurate to the investment that they're making. Page 13, table 7, M7, providing bike repair workshops or clinics. It felt like if this was going to be required of large non-residential projects, then it should be required of large residential projects as well, because commuting is tied, or travel is tied to residential projects as well. And then page 14, table 8, E1, the implement multimodal network improvements. This, to me, it seemed weird that we would require it of residential, but not non-residential ones. Since so much of trips are commutes, it feels like we absolutely should require this of the non-residential projects if we're going to require it of residential ones. E2, this was another one where I was like, is this really going to make a difference? Provide on-site delivery amenities. I mean, we live in an age where like you can get anything delivered to your house. Or your work via Amazon or Grubhub or Instacart or whatever. So I'm not really sure what an on-site delivery amenity is, and if it's needed to get to have people get things delivered to these sites. For E5, providing a bike repair station, I also felt like this should be required of large residential projects if it's going to be required of large non-residential projects. And this is where like some of the language in the manual is pretty broad. What does provided mean? It feels like for some of these things, it's not enough just to provide it at the start. Like you've got to maintain these facilities. You've got to make sure that the station is stocked and is in good condition, and so how do we account for some of that? E10, provide on-site family supportive amenities. Again, it seemed like if you're going to require this for large non-residential, it would make sense to require it for large residential. And that's all of my comments on these strategies, so thank you for letting me go through that. Is the penalty structure sufficient to induce compliance? I think Commissioner Wiggins made a really good point that some of our larger, more well-funded developers are going to do the math and say, is it cheaper to implement these 20 points of requirements, or is it cheaper to pay the fines, especially if I don't have to pay fines for the first 4 years? And so I think that's something to think about when we come up with those fine amounts. Page 20, table 13, which is the fine schedule, to me, it felt like a really big jump to go from $5,000 a point to $25,000 a point, going from small to large projects, especially thinking about if you're a 50-unit project versus a 49-unit project, like adding that one extra unit is gonna really make those fees jump up a lot. And so does that do weird things to incentives in terms of the sizes of projects? And then the other thing I thought was 3 years of noncompliance feels like a really long time to go without a corrective plan. A recent example with the parking garage at Verkada, I mean, our community got really concerned after a few months, and it was a repeated issue that was brought up, and I know that residents were talking to staff quite frequently after just a few months, and so my suggestion was to reduce the number of years by one, before a corrective plan is required. So light green, go to 0 to 1 years of compliance, orange, go to non-compliant for 2 years, and red, go to non-compliant for 3+ years. Because I think that would, if I remember my math correctly, that would require a corrective plan after 1 year. And even then, I feel like going a whole year before requiring a plan, much less a fix, feels like quite a long time. And then in terms of the last question of is the supplementary policy manual clear, I think the policy really helps break down the process and what the strategies are. Just as a few of us have noted before, I think some of the language is a little bit broad, and maybe that's the way it has to be, in terms of like how much of an infrastructure improvement is enough to get the credit. But I think as long as it's clear that it's up to the transportation demand manager or staff to make that call, then that seems fine to me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Through the chair. Thanks. +1 to everything Vice Chair Patel said, and then I have a couple other things. Thank you so much for taking all our questions and all these comments. So in terms of the thresholds and requirements, I also asked Sue Ellen about existing residential buildings and the concern there. I don't, in the council direction notes, it does say that, some council members expressed concern or opposition to that. Others wanted everything included. So I do think we have a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to council, and would recommend looking into this a bit further. The issue of like legal needs to look at it. Well, they should look at it, please. Please, just figure out if there is even a there, or if not, right? That's the level of clarity I think would be appropriate, because there is a lot of these projects in the city, and they would actually benefit, perhaps even more so, from TDM measures. And then with the affordable housing, 50%, you know how I feel on that, insofar as you could think about it in terms of everything is included, but maybe they need to be, you would expect more ad hoc, case-by-case exemptions for them. That's one pathway to consider. Another pathway to consider is what is an incentive structure for the below 50% affordable housing units, such that, is it that, are there resources available to help them identify the grants to ensure that TDM measures can be part of the solution? And that increases the burden on city staff, which is why I'm trying to think about, well, what is the most efficient use of city staff time while also capturing the benefits to this sector of our population that likely, I think there's alignment needs, would benefit the most from TDM measures. So I do think that does require deeper council discussion, and I think that there's a lot of goodwill on the council in terms of trying to think about affordable housing and thinking that exemptions are the correct policy fix, but in fact, the ramifications of them, and we see this with building decarb ordinances, which I'm more familiar with in my career, that in fact, no, it actually leads to more health impacts and more concerns in that space, and I could see the same kinds of negative consequences happening here as well. Even though everyone, I think, wants the same thing, which is the least amount of burden. In terms of are the required TDM measures for each project type appropriate, I too share a bit of Commissioner Robbins' skepticism on some of these measures, especially the education ones. I was really curious, for instance, if there's I tried to do the math, but it also got a little confusing insofar as could a project just do all education measures and satisfy their TDM requirement? I wasn't quite sure. And if the answer is yes to that, I think there's a fail in the policy a bit, because I do think that those other 3 categories that you listed out, Matt, are more structural in nature and can create more long-term durable change than an education program. So someone else can do the math, but that was my main concern as a top line. I wouldn't want a plan to just have education stuff, and maybe that's a policy manual fix later. You know, if you see a lot of these plans come in the door the first year and it's just like 90% education stuff, then we know that this isn't quite working, right? And that's okay. In terms of the penalty structure, I agree with Vice Chair Patel on the need to shorten it, right? So if it's, I looked again at the council remarks here, and they were very clear that they did not want a certificate of occupancy revocation, but that was actually the only point of like complete alignment according to the notes. In terms of the 3 strikes, I respect that, and so far as like, okay, then let's start penalties at year 3, not year 4. And moving things up the way Vice Chair Patel explained, I totally agree with him. I was going to make that exact recommendation. And I do think those interventions, because we have been frustrated on Bay Meadows, right? There are 2 projects in Bay Meadows that is just chronically not hitting their stride. And I think they're only on year, Sue Ellen, are they only on year 3 right now? And we're already deeply frustrated, like deeply frustrated, you know, on that front. So I just think like we need to, the level of proactivity needs to happen a little earlier, and then try to, you know, figure out if there's a way. Nobody wants these fines to actually hit. It's not like the city's waiting on them, you know, or eager to receive them or anything like that, right? It's meant to be, it's that backstop, but we need that backstop to happen earlier. This also then aligns with climate goals and general quality of life. That goes to my the supplementary policy manual remarks I want to make, and this I'll take. I apologize to everyone. I will have a bit of words on this. So the content is all there, and I think the content is really great. I was genuinely confused by the structure, because I do believe that this policy manual, as it's developed right now, is the best eyes for it is city staff or other implementers, maybe commute.org or something like that. As it's currently outlined in the current layout of it, I do think it's a fairly confusing document for a user of like someone who needs to comply. And so I'll explain that a little bit in more detail. The flow chart on page 4 of the policy manual is very confusing. For one, I struggled with it myself. And I think there's also this thing of, you know, when I kind of thought through it a little bit more of like how to make this easier, perhaps there's like a chapter or subsector sections for each of the user types. So new development residential could have a subsection. New development non-residential could have a different subsection. Existing non-residential uses could have a different subsection. And then significant changes maybe. I'm not sure exactly, but I do think there's some need for that, because it starts to get very confusing, because you're asking a user to think about, okay, what kind of use are they? How small are they? And then let me go track that and thumb through 60 pages to find the information that I need for my compliance, and it creates a lot of barriers. This is a great central document for an implementer. But when you get to the actual like strategies in Appendix A, it gets very confusing. Like, okay, what am I allowed to do? You know, some of them are required, some of them are not for different uses, but like, and then there's a point value at the top, but that point value at the top doesn't apply for the thing that it's required, right? That's like a moot point. User-wise, this is not actually terribly clear. And so I think if you were to think it, reorient it to think about that user, it would be really helpful. Now, that might be in additional materials. Maybe this is the document we need for, like I said, implementers, but then you have like a user guide or something, and you iterate it, you reorient it differently. I'm not saying you need to like completely change this thing. What I am saying is that this thing, I would be worried about a lot of human error based upon the format. And the potential unfamiliarity of this stuff. In all of the charts for each of the strategies in the appendix, there are blanks. I think the blanks mean that they actually could do that measure, and it's not required, but they would get the point value. Again, that's not super clear, right? So those are the kinds of things that I think could lead to a higher success rate and a higher engagement with the materials once they go into implementation. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Through the chair. First, I want to thank everybody who's spoken before me for your thorough comments and questions. The first comment I have is actually a response to Commissioner Patel's comment and about the required TDM measures. So this is something I noticed in Table 8, the TDM strategies, the site enhancements on page 4 of Table 8. And the question was, is this required of both residential and non-residential new development? And the table shows only residential, but the actual strategy description back further down on page 24 shows that it's for both residential and non-residential uses. So I think the table is just wrong. You're getting a nod. Okay, that's good. When I go back to do the thresholds and requirements of projects that are proposed seem reasonable, I would say yes, I do. And I want to talk about affordable housing specifically. Any project that is 50% affordable housing will be subsidized unless there's significant unprecedented policy and financial sector changes that occur at the local, state, and national level. Any sort of additional requirements that we impose on affordable housing is going to reduce the number of units or eliminate the financial feasibility of that project. And if we add this as a requirement to affordable housing, I know it sounds nice to have it be equal, but the number one transit demand measure that you can do is add a single unit of affordable housing in the city. So if we do something that reduces the number of units that can be built in the city, because again, affordable housing, we're talking about subsidized housing, that's a trade-off that we should not be willing to make, because even if they're not going to be able to have bicycle education or great bicycle parking, just the fact that there's another affordable unit in the city is the best transit TDM measure that we could do. And so I'm not willing to budge on that. If the affordable housing developers say that this is not something that we want to have applied to us, I would respect that. My dad ran a social services nonprofit on the East Coast that built and ran affordable housing. The subsidies are required. They're real. Financing, making things pencil is really hard. So don't touch that. I know it sounds, it's hard, but it's troubling. Next, with regard to a question, Chair Ebenetter had about the 30% reduction target statewide. It would be nice to be able to say that, but also I can see it as a complex issue at this point, because if we create a TDM program that reduces development potential in San Mateo by pushing the target up, we actually might be pushing development that would otherwise occur here to somewhere like Gilroy. So that would actually be creating more VMT. So again, there's trade-offs to the requirements. And any reduction here is going to be greater than a reduction further out from the metro region. I also want to just plus one to Kimmy's breakdown of her mention of the breaking down the flow chart and the strategies into specific use types. And I think making it easier for the end user would be really helpful, because I was also confused by a lot of it. Even though this is a great document, I'm really excited for it. I did find it difficult to follow. And if somebody who's coming to the city for the first time, or even just after a few years, is going to probably have some trouble parsing what needs to be done. And then also, I was also want to plus one the confusion that can occur between the points and the required strategies and how those interplay. If it was maybe a little bit more clear on the charts and also on the descriptions of the of the strategies. And then the other thing I want to mention, just as far as are the TDM measures for each project type appropriate? This is, I don't know exactly how to fit it in, but I feel like some of the point values may not be, there's some things that are maybe weighted too low or too high with point values. Like, I think the strategy E1, the implementing multimodal network improvements, is one of the most important things, because if people don't feel safe or comfortable doing non-driving activities, then they're not going to do it as much. So I think that maybe adding points to that to encourage it more would be helpful, especially for a change of use project where you're not necessarily assuming that they're going to tear up a sidewalk or repave the road in front of it or something like that. I think that having higher points would encourage that, and that's always something that's really difficult for the city because those things cost money. And then also just on the same vein of appropriate TDM measures, I wonder if in the future it would be worth studying an additional strategy that would not be a required strategy, but would allow for the assignment of significant points if developers, maybe of a certain threshold of development, were to pay into a citywide dedicated sustainable transportation infrastructure fund, because that could produce more meaningful change than some of the strategies I see. And just creating this kind of fund, and think long term, we could get more out of it than some of the other things. Obviously, it's hard to say, oh, everything here is great, but how do we weight it, and what are the most important things? And my perspective is always the built environment. And yeah, those are my comments. But overall, I'm impressed. I don't have expertise in this, so I want to just make my appreciation known.
Thank you, Adam.
Hi. I agree with a lot of the points said by other commissioners, but I'll go through new ones. So for the first one regarding thresholds, yes, I think it's fine, and I may have missed it, but I think it'd be helpful to have language about existing commercial, like what their time for compliance is. Maybe it was in there, but just emphasizing that. For TDM measures, the one that regarding points that stuck out to me that I was surprised was as low as it was having a TDM coordinator. I think it was only 0.5 points. That seemed a little low to me. And speaking of points, I don't know, this is take it or leave it, but it just seems clear to me not to have points or half points, just to have whole numbers. Also in the total numbers, I think there was an 11.5, and it just feels cleaner not to have half points. Regarding TDM measures, if it's not too late, there are a few more I would love to see included. For example, and speaking about included, I'd also hope that this is a flexible document that can be added to as measures are tested out or seen more successful through case studies in San Mateo. But, and if I missed any of these, please ignore me, but I'd like to see, there was car sharing, but I didn't see anything for bike sharing membership. That's hopefully going to be growing in the region. So if that's available, I think it would be great to have bike sharing membership or stations at these developments. And then with the increase of micromobility, also charging for bikes and scooters in the secure locker areas. And then for maybe some really high point ones, this was in one of the stakeholder comments, but to have on-site childcare and works, or in the residential areas to have workspaces for people who work at home, I think could really add some motivation to drive less. And then regarding the penalties, I too thought that the jump seemed pretty high between the two small and large projects, especially also for the monitoring fees that they doubled. And like someone had said, it could just be one housing unit difference and everything doubles. And then I, too, agree that the policy manual was a bit confusing in the beginning. That flowchart, even the information presented tonight as it was through the PowerPoint was much more clear. Of course, you were there to explain it to me, but also the graphics felt a lot clearer and versus what's in the manual. Overall, the manual's amazing. I think it's going to be so informative. I like that each measure in the appendix is on its own page. That feels very clear, but there's just a couple too many tables. I think they could be consolidated. That flowchart can be more graphically pleasing, user-friendly. There was some typos. I think the numbering on the M ones were off. Take a look at that. And in the appendix, also the checklist had some typos. And I think that's it, and I too agree this is a great effort, and it's amazing seeing it come together and being compiled, and I hope there's plans to come out as it's implemented with some case studies as part of the monitoring, because we're going to be compiling excellent information to inform how effective all this is. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for the presentation and all the effort that's gone into this. It's generally impressive document. In response to the questions, I'll try not to repeat what everyone else has said. I don't have a lot of new unique items, but generally I would say the thresholds seem clear. The one item that I talked about was the pre-tax benefit requirement for a small business. So I think that the existing non-residential small project is 25 to 90 employees, and I guess I might consider that the low end would be 50 employees. I do think that can be a burden for certain kinds of small businesses, such as restaurants. Otherwise, I'd say the thresholds seem reasonable. Item number 2 was are the required TDM measures for each project type appropriate? Yes, except for that item I just mentioned. I guess the other comment I was thinking about is that, on the other hand, they're not 100% utilized in small businesses, so it's not necessarily a costly burden to every small business. Maybe it doesn't apply to certain kinds of businesses, but I think we want to go forward assuming that all these measures are as close to fully utilized as possible. So we want to make sure they're successful measures. Along the same lines, though, some items are not going to be highly utilized or they're not going to be high impact measures, such as the ones that we talked about for I forget what they were called, the training, safety classes, that kind of thing, or repair classes. Yes, the points are low, but again, I guess I think it's important to have measures that can have a good impact and can be fully utilized. So I don't know, I guess it's a trade-off. I think they're generally appropriate, but those are the dilemmas. Are the penalties appropriate? I appreciate the comments from others about the 4 years of noncompliance. Thank you to all the fellow commissioners on that. I had thought it was appropriate in the vein of not penalizing people and being, as supportive and educational as possible. But I've now changed my mind, and I agree with the other commissioners that, the fees should probably be incurred a year earlier. It does seem like a long time, having thought about that. And then the supplementary policy manual, yes, my comments were that it's generally clear, but that it's really long and frankly kind of daunting for the applicant or users. I mean, we're studying this, but this is keep in mind for the applicant or the team of the applicant, this is just one of many checklists that they have to work through. Cal Green checklist is one thing, maybe it's a LEED project or similar type sustainable structure. These checklists go on and on. So I think it could be maybe a little more succinct, I think would help. So those are my comments.
Thank you.
Okay, Sue Ellen, to answer the first question on thresholds and requirements seem reasonable, I'm going to refer to Table 1 where it has project thresholds for applicability and exemptions. Okay. So my first comment on this, and I think, once again, I'm real sensitive, I'm sure as well as my fellow commissioners and staff here, to encourage development, be it new, or the addition of new units without an enormous amount of burden, and then also starting and running a small business in our city. I know from personal experience. But anyway, going back to thresholds and requirements seem reasonable. I would encourage or recommend the following changes. Under existing non-residential users, 25 to 99. I would either put them under exemptions. Currently, exemptions is 0 through 24. I would do 0 through 99. Another option is if the city is compelled to keep the 25 through 99 employees, that they not only they too have a menu to select from, be it tax-deferred transportation benefits or any of the other TDM measures to choose. And that could include education. So that would be my recommendation as it relates to thresholds and requirements. I will share with you, I'm torn. I've heard really compelling arguments on both sides on affordable housing. And Seema and Kimmy and Segal made some very compelling arguments, is that this group of housing needs to be lifted up, not left behind. So I'm leaning towards that. And I hear Adam's argument wholly, I understand. But here's where I'm going to go with my next comment, is are required TDM measures for each project type appropriate? And I believe Seema mentioned about the need to include measures. I would take that one step further, and can we include inexpensive measures that possibly would be practical and could be used by the affordable housing community or buildings, as well as other properties. You had mentioned to me that you had heard from the developers, both the profit, nonprofit, kind of grumbling on costs. I get it. California's great on packing on costs. So that might be a way to straddle that divide, because they can't be left behind. They have to be brought forward, and there could be options to do so if we dug deeper. Once again, going back to the TDM measures, as I mentioned, under existing residential users, I would give them the full menu, not only tax-deferred benefits. That costs money, by the way. I know from personal experience, it does. It's not an easy it's not just simply a software change. I forgot this too, sorry. I'm gonna go back to question 1 on thresholds and requirements. Once again, going back to table 1, significant changes in use and building additions. Currently, small projects are 10,000 to 49,000 square feet, ground square feet. Once again, I think I would take that out and I would put that under exemptions, 0 to 49,000 ground square feet. And why am I doing that? I want to encourage the addition of units on smaller complexes. Like I said, I'm very sensitive to encouraging building in our city, both new and additional. Let's see. penalty structure. I thought the penalty structure was fine, and congratulations on that. 4 years was fine. I would echo Commissioner Robbins' comment. Like him, I prefer incentives, but if everyone feels comfortable with, like I said, I'm comfortable with the 4 years. I can buy that. And then is the supplementary policy manual clear regarding compliance? I thought it was pretty clear, but work could be done, and I think people have said enough on that. I would add, I would really build out the appeals section, and we've gone through, and it's in my brain really well, how to handle appeals efficiently and effectively. So I think that needs to be built out. I would also include, if this is appropriate for the policy manual, neighborhoods. Now, I understand that when projects are, whether it's new projects or major redevelopments, that there are community meetings. Is that correct? Okay. And it's in those meetings that we might need to update the code to, or I'm not quite sure how, but in those meetings, the TDM needs to be presented to the neighborhood. So that is, these community meetings are done for the neighborhood, the surrounding neighborhood to these complexes. And so this should be included in those meetings, and I don't know whether that is put in this manual or where that's done. Okay, and that's all I have.
Thank you. Thank you to Sue Ellen and Matt. Sue Ellen, you always put together a fantastic summary and presentation. You did it again. This is an extremely difficult subject, and thank you for all of your hard work. I hope that this will be implemented to the extent that it can help all of the city move forward. Also, I want to thank the Sustainability and Infrastructure Commission. As Joe Goltos years ago told me, this was going to be the commission that had all the superstars on it, and I think you've lived up to it. Thank you so much for your comments. Of course, I'm used to that level of expertise being surrounded by the commissioners on the Planning Commission. I don't have a lot to say because you guys have done a tremendous amount of work. As far as the thresholds and requirements are, I'm fine pretty much 90% with what's been is in there. I'm sure you'll implement some of the other comments to present to the City Council. Are the required TDM measures for each project type appropriate? I'm mostly concerned about existing residential. I don't know how you get them on board. It's kind of like we're going to, you know, we've always had trouble with the existing residential on how we're going to upgrade them for environmental components. Single-family homes, same problem. If you don't do them, then you're never going to catch up. And I feel the same way with existing multifamily residential. I have the same concern with the penalty structure, but I want to tie that into kind of with the supplemental policy manual. As we all know, it's extremely difficult to get housing built anywhere in California, and the costs are exorbitant. And I know that the developers have to make a certain amount of money, and I am always concerned that we're putting more burden on them. And the city is not taking on this themselves. They're being mandated by the state to do this. But sometimes it's somewhat counterproductive. I'm happy to hear that other people felt that the policy manual was not quite as clear as it was, because that means that I kind of was right also. I was thinking back that I liked it, but it was hard to grasp the whole thing, including the original graph. It was kind of all over the place. And I immediately went to, well, what's a developer going to think? I don't want to be a developer if this is what I have to go through. And I know they have to jump through hoops, but I think, as has been pointed out, the easier we make it for them, the better it's going to be for everybody. And I know that is always your goal. And you know, to get there is really important, because our housing is not being built by any extent that we would hope. The penalty structure, I think, I don't know if I mentioned it, I don't see why it would go to 4 years. But I also think that what I have experienced with fines levied by the city is that if an applicant thinks they're substantially in compliance, they go to the city council for to see if they can be relieved of that. And I don't know if that is part of this measure here. I know, different fines, you can go to the council and ask them, personally, or, the appeal. And I would think that you would probably have to have that type of a process offered here also. All in all, I think the project looks great, lots of effort into it, and I think it's got the potential to help us citywide, but only time will tell. I'm a little concerned with the VRT, and that was a new term for me, and how it plays all into the structure of this. I know that at one point it was mentioned that, I know the consultants had some more stringent guidelines than I think the council wanted to adhere to. And that leaves me with an overall arching question is that, do the consultant and staff think that this is the best measure that we can have here in San Mateo to help us? Because I know there were other issues that you wanted to have included, and they said no. So does that leave us with a B- or a C project or program, or do we still feel good that this is solid enough to make a substantial change in the way that we travel throughout the city? And that's not an answer that I can say, but you're you tried to get what you could from the council, and I don't know if you got what you really wanted to make it as robust as it could be. So those are my comments. I don't know if we have any other things to touch on. Any last minute?
Sorry, through the chair. I feel compelled to throw in one more comment on the affordable housing discussion, which was excellent, and I strongly agree with both sides. And I feel like the one thing I want to say is, in my limited experience, I'm not an affordable housing developer, but in my limited experience working with them, Byzantine is not even the word for what they have to go through to get funding to do affordable housing. And they make difficult and uncomfortable trade-offs all the time with the strings that are attached to the particular funding that they can get. And I just feel like I have to support what Commissioner Nugent was talking about. It's it's so hard to get it built that for me I can't. And it would be one thing if that those developers who actually fight these fights all day long were saying, okay, we're in support, but I'm just compelled to listen to them because the little bit that I understand about it is it's wild how complex it is. And I want them to have all the same services as well. And I think it would be an overstatement to say that if you put on one more piece, it won't get built. But it's probably right to say that you'll lose something else. And that may be something that you wanted even more. It could be supportive services on site. For example, there's a slew of gaps we're trying to fill socially with affordable housing. And so I don't know. I don't want to bring that up now and then we talk about it for 30 minutes more. That's fine if we do. But it's just so hard that if they're saying that it's a concern to them, I feel like I have to hear that. Anyway, that was my other piece. But thanks again for everyone. This is such an excellent discussion. I'm so lucky to be here with both commissions to hear at least twice as many good perspectives. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Martin. Any other closing comments on this item? Okay, we'll close that item and go to announcements, please.
Yes, thank you to the chair. I have a couple of announcements that may interest both the commissions. So first of all, thank you to S&I for joining us tonight. I wanted to note that the City Council is making some changes to the rules and procedures that will be rolling out soon through the City Clerk's office related to the order of events. So it is possible that all commissions would take public comments before the clarifying questions, just so that public has an opportunity to weigh in sooner into the process. So that'll be rolled out shortly and may affect your next upcoming meetings. There are also some vacancies on different commissions that have been advertised through the City Council's office, and the deadline to apply for those is, I believe, April 16th. So I believe we will have one vacancy on our commission, and I wanted to share that Commissioner Wiggins' term will end in June, and he has mentioned that he will not be looking for a reappointment, and we'll be really sad to see him go. I know we still have a couple of months and some exciting projects ahead of us, so we will celebrate your time on the commission closer to that date, Commissioner Wiggins. And I believe the SNI Commission also may have a vacancy, so just putting the word out might be helpful. In terms of Planning Commission, so I know we didn't have our meeting last couple of weeks ago, but on March 18th, the City Council did adopt the general plan, so that was very exciting. And we will be looking to take the implementation plan to the City Council sometime in June to lay out the work plan and I think hundreds of implementation action items in the general plan and also in our housing element at that point to prioritize. For the next meeting on April 23rd, we are looking at a 6 p.m. start time. This is just for the Planning Commission to accommodate 3 items that'll go that night. One is a zoning map amendment associated with a code enforcement case that's been longstanding that we're looking to resolve. The second item will be the continued appeal from the last meeting, and we are looking to bring the housing element to the Commission as well that night for adoption, for a recommendation to council on adoption. So I believe all the commissioners were available at 6 p.m. So we will have quorum and we're noticing the projects accordingly. I think that wraps it up from my end.
Thank you. Any comments from commissioners? With that, we'll close the meeting. Thank you all.